Right now, 7 meters above a man walking down a city street in the Netherlands, the ocean is sitting there, held back by a single wall, because the city he's standing in was built inside a hole carved below sea level. And if you're wondering how that's even possible, you need to understand that 26% of this entire country should be underwater right now, and yet 17 million people live there anyway, on a street that was 3 meters underwater in 1953, where a mother is pushing a pram past a spot, where, decades ago, a ship legally had the right-of-way over a highway sailing above it. And this is the story of how a country decided the ocean simply wasn't allowed to win. It starts with geography working against them from the beginning. The North Sea behaves like a funnel pointed directly at the Dutch coastline, and every major storm that forms out in the North Atlantic eventually gets channeled straight toward this one low-lying stretch of land. And on the night of January 31st, 1953, a storm that had formed south of Iceland found that funnel and followed it home. At 4 o'clock in the morning, while entire villages slept, the dikes protecting them began to fail one after another, and by the time the sun came up, 1,836 people who had gone to bed the night before were gone. 150,000 hectares of land sat underwater, and one single village alone lost 305 people before dawn. In the chaos, a mayor made a decision that sounds almost mythical now. He ordered a ship's captain to deliberately ram his own vessel into a crumbling section of dike, plugging the breach with the hull of a ship and, in doing so, saving an estimated 3 million people downstream from the same fate. 17 days after the water finally receded, the Dutch government stood up and said 2 words that would define the next 70 years of the country's engineering identity. Never again. Except this time, it came with an actual plan, one built on the work of an engineer who had spent 20 years warning the government about exactly this kind of catastrophe, whose reports were ignored again and again, and who died before he ever got to see the country finally listen to him. And here's the part that sounds almost absurd out loud. The plan wasn't just to build higher walls. It was to shorten the entire Dutch coastline by 700 kilometers, using structures that had literally never been attempted before anywhere on Earth, starting with a single, uninterrupted wall 32 kilometers long, built straight across open, violent ocean, separating the raging North Sea on one side from what would become a calm, tamed lake on the other. The idea belonged to an engineer named Cornelis Lely, who proposed sealing off the entire Zuiderzee, an enormous inland sea, with one continuous dam, and people at the time genuinely called him insane for suggesting it. 10,000 workers, 27 dredging vessels, and 4 separate construction sites operated simultaneously, building the wall from the middle of the open sea outward in both directions at once, vacuuming material straight off the ocean floor and piling 36 million cubic meters of it into a barrier rising directly out of open water. Before any of that material could be trusted to stay in place, woven willow mats had to be sunk to the seafloor first as a stabilizing base layer. Without them, the clay being piled on top would simply drift away and disappear into the current. At one point, shipworm, a marine mollusk that bores through submerged wood, ate straight through an entire section of the foundation from the inside out, hollowing out timber and corroding the steel around it, until the base of the structure was simply gone, forcing crews to rebuild the rotted sections in the dead of winter, working directly in the sea, this time replacing wood with basalt, one of the hardest volcanic rocks on Earth, stacked by hand along the exposed face because salt water has no effect on it at all. As the gap in the dam narrowed to its final 50 meters, the tide in that remaining channel was still running at 5 knots, and crews had only one real chance to close it for good, so they waited for slack water, the brief, narrow window twice a day when the tide pauses between directions, and in that window, barges dumped material as fast as they could while the gap shrank, 30 meters, then 10, then finally, in one afternoon, it closed completely, sealing off an entire inland sea in a single decisive act, the wall standing 9 meters wide at its base, holding back a sea that had been pushing against this exact stretch of coastline since 1932. But locking the ocean out wasn't actually the end goal. The Dutch wanted the seafloor itself. An entire province of the modern Netherlands was still open water as recently as 1940, and engineers pulled it directly out of the lake bed over the following 27 years using a method nobody had ever attempted at this scale. Trap a section of lake behind a ring-shaped dike, then simply pump it dry. Once the pump started running, the water level inside the ring fell centimeter by centimeter, and a seabed that hadn't seen open air in 10,000 years began surfacing in real time, looking, by every visual account, more like the cracked, barren surface of Mars than anything resembling Dutch farmland. And the reeds that eventually took root across that drying mud weren't planted by anyone. The wind carried the seeds in naturally, And engineers simply let nature do that particular part of the work while they controlled everything else. Fields that now sit 5 meters below sea level are kept dry by drainage ditches that run continuously, 24 hours a day without pause, and tractors now cross ground that was, in some cases, open lake water just a single year earlier, engineers effectively commanding the soil itself into existence. During the Second World War, occupying German forces deliberately flooded the same reclaimed land, forcing Dutch engineers to drain the exact same province twice, simply because they had no other option available to them. Roads were built before a single house went up, and farm plots were surveyed and measured before there was a single resident to live on them. An entire layer of civilization planned into existence on ground pulled directly from the ocean floor. But draining that land created a brand new problem entirely of the engineer's own making. Draining reclaimed soil compacts the underlying clay, and compacted clay sinks, meaning the very act of creating this land was slowly causing it to settle back downward again. The solution was counterintuitive. Don't drain it too aggressively. Keep a controlled amount of moisture in the soil at all times, managing the rate of compaction deliberately rather than draining as fast as physically possible. And engineers went so far as to design and plan an entire future city on this land before the soil beneath it had even finished drying, then built that exact plan once the ground was ready. 3 pumping stations have run continuously since 1942 to keep that reclaimed province above water. And if those pumps were ever to stop entirely, the region known as Flevoland would flood again within a matter of time. One resident whose father was literally born on a boat floating above this exact spot before it became land. Put it simply, they pulled an entire province out of the mud with nothing but engineering and persistence. Nature, in turn, forced the Dutch to seal off the rest of their coastline just as aggressively, and this first great enclosure project, completed in 1960, became the foundation for everything that followed. Every lesson learned building it was carried directly into structures built decades later, on a scale nobody had previously attempted. Along other stretches of coast, engineers developed an entirely different construction method. Build massive concrete boxes on land, float them out to sea, then deliberately sink them into position. A technique repeated 13 separate times along the Dutch coastline. Dock doors would open, seawater would rush in, and a 5,000-ton concrete caisson would float free and head out toward open water under its own buoyancy. But floating something that size out to sea turns out to be the easy part. Actually sinking it in the right place, at the right angle against a moving current, is where everything gets dangerous because, in more than one case, the current caught the caisson and began spinning it uncontrollably in the water, forcing crews to rely on seabed anchors dropped in advance with steel cables pulling taut to physically arrest the rotation and force the massive structure to descend in a straight, controlled line instead of tumbling sideways into position. Steel cables were strung across entire open estuaries. Rock was dropped by the ton into racing tidal currents to build supporting foundations. And it was during this phase that engineers ran headfirst into a problem nobody had fully anticipated. Sealing off these tidal sea inlets completely was killing every living organism inside them, an entire ecosystem suffocating the moment the barriers closed off natural tidal flow. And the public backlash was immediate and furious. Mussel farmers and environmental advocates demanded the water be allowed to keep flowing, insisting that a fully solid dam would leave nothing alive behind it. So, remarkably, the engineers made a decision almost unheard of in a project of this scale. They scrapped the original design and started over completely, adding roughly 10 years and $2.4 billion to the program. But with each successive dam in the new design, construction actually got faster, the final structures going up in a matter of days rather than the weeks earlier sections had required. With the fully solid dams finished across most of the coastline, one final 9-kilometer gap remained open, a channel where the sea still rushed in and out twice daily with the tide. And closing that gap without killing the ecosystem behind it meant engineers had to design something that had never existed before anywhere in the world. A movable barrier, 65 massive concrete piers holding 62 individual steel gates, each one capable of standing open during calm weather to preserve natural tidal flow and closing completely only when a storm surge threatened. To even begin building it, engineers first constructed an artificial island from scratch in the middle of the open estuary, completing roughly 1 pier per month across 5 full years of continuous concrete casting, with the precise slots that would eventually guide each steel gate cast into that concrete to millimeter level accuracy. Enormous concrete foundation mats, each weighing 5,500 tons, were lowered 30 meters down onto the seabed, placed within 20 centimeters of their exact target position every single time, using 2 custom-built ships constructed specifically for this one project alone and never used again afterward, each capable of lifting 20,000 tons at once. As each pier's formwork climbed continuously upward while the concrete below it hardened, the process never fully stopped, the structure growing steadily taller in a slow, unbroken rhythm. And to move completed piers into position, one of the specialized ships would actually sink its own deck low enough for a finished pier to float directly over it, then rise back up, lifting 18,000 tons of concrete clear of the water and carrying it into place with a required accuracy of 20 centimeters, before lowering that same 18,000 tons down onto a prepared foundation mattress 30 meters below the surface, guided entirely by GPS. During one of these operations, engineers discovered a void beneath the intended foundation area, roughly 15 meters across, a single miscalculation that came close to derailing the entire placement. Grout was pumped through pipes to fill the gap completely. Sensors confirmed the fill had solidified, and only then was the pier allowed to complete its descent safely, a genuine crisis resolved just in time. 62 individual steel gates, each one 42 meters wide and weighing 480 tons, had to be hung between the finished concrete piers directly out and open. C, threaded into their concrete guide slots with only 50 millimeters of clearance on either side, maneuvered into position using a floating crane with essentially no room for error. Each gate was engineered as a fully self-contained unit. One motor, one spindle mechanism, no external power cabling required to operate it. And if the primary automated control system ever failed, every single gate could still be operated manually as a backup. On October 4th, 1986, Queen Beatrix personally gave the command, and all 62 gates dropped into position simultaneously, sealing 9 kilometers of open sea in just 75 minutes and completing the enclosure of the Zeeland estuary for good, meaning that from that day forward, any storm surge hitting this stretch of coastline would slam into reinforced concrete and steel instead of sleeping coastal towns. The barrier has now operated for 38 years, its hydraulic systems requiring constant, careful maintenance because the sea behind it never stops moving, not for a single day. And when asked how many times the barrier has actually been forced to close in that entire span, the answer is roughly 30 times in 38 years. The sea tested it and lost every single time. That structure saved Zeeland, but the port city of Rotterdam faced an even more dangerous vulnerability, one that would require engineers to design a machine that, at the time, simply did not exist anywhere in the world. When the alarm eventually fires at this location, dock gates open, and 2 mechanical arms, each one heavier than the entire steel structure of the Eiffel Tower, begin swinging into motion. Because Europe's busiest port cannot ever be permanently sealed off from shipping traffic, yet it still needs the ability to close itself off completely within hours whenever a serious storm threatens. Engineers were given roughly 6 years to solve that contradiction, and the solution they arrived at involved 2 enormous hollow steel gates that float freely when the port is open, swing together to meet in the middle of the river when triggered, then deliberately flood themselves with water and sink directly onto the riverbed to form a complete seal. Building it meant first excavating 2 separate concrete construction pits on opposite banks of one of the busiest shipping channels in Europe, and in 1991, an enormous concrete platform was poured directly across that same active waterway, while cargo ships continued sailing over the construction zone throughout the entire process. Each of the 2 arms measures 210 meters of welded steel, engineered to float when intentionally flooded, and to sink precisely on command in a specific controlled sequence, and a supporting steel truss structure 237 meters long was built with one singular purpose: funneling every ton of force the North Sea could throw at the barrier down into a single connecting point. That connecting point is a ball joint manufactured in the Czech Republic, 10 meters across and weighing 680 tons, the largest ball joint ever, constructed anywhere in the world, installed once with absolutely no opportunity for a second attempt, and engineered to allow a 6,800-ton steel arm to swing with essentially complete freedom of movement around it. When the dock gates finally opened and river water rushed in for the very first time, 6,800 tons of steel began floating for the first time in its existence, and engineers discovered the gate was sitting 340 millimeters off level on a structure 110 meters long. That kind of imbalance is genuinely catastrophic if left uncorrected. The structure contained 26 separate internal ballast compartments, each individually adjustable, and crews spent time carefully redistributing water between them until the entire 210-meter arm was trimmed to within 15 millimeters of level across its full length. The barrier today is run almost entirely by an automated decision system known as BOS. No human operator presses a button to close it. The computer system monitors water levels continuously, and the moment it detects a surge 3 meters above normal conditions, it independently makes the decision to close, commands both arms to swing shut, and roughly 2 hours later, the river is completely sealed. an entire national infrastructure decision made with 0 human beings in the final loop. Each swinging arm sweeps 180 meters of open river as it moves toward the other, 6,800 tons of steel eventually settling down onto the riverbed to complete the seal. And with that, one of the busiest ports on the planet had a defense mechanism the North Sea had genuinely never encountered before. In November of 2007, that automated system triggered its first real non-test closure in response to an actual storm, sealing the port completely while Rotterdam stayed entirely dry, the gates reopening roughly 6 hours later once the threat had passed. But while steel and concrete protected the country's largest and wealthiest ports, smaller towns and villages simply couldn't justify the enormous cost of infrastructure on that scale, which meant engineers needed an entirely different category of solution for a waterways too wide to justify a steel barrier but far too important to leave completely unprotected. The answer, remarkable in its simplicity, is a wall made of rubber that rises directly out of the riverbed when needed and is completely invisible the rest of the time. 3 separate rubber tubes lying flat against the bottom of the waterway, protecting roughly 110,000 people behind a single unguarded channel, made from rubber and Kevlar composite material, only about 2 centimeters thick, tested to intentional structural failure in the lab, before a single unit was ever installed for real. From the surface, nothing about this stretch of river looks any different from any other, every supporting pipe and mechanism completely hidden from view. But when the alarm sounds, compressed air fills the internal chambers, and within about 30 minutes, all 3 flat rubber shapes rise off the riverbed, forming a complete 10-meter wall across the waterway within roughly an hour. No crane required, no mechanical gate, no steel structure at all. The pump houses supporting the system were deliberately designed to resemble armadillos, and that resemblance is entirely intentional. Armor, built specifically to protect the delicate mechanisms hidden inside. During one real storm event, the surge reached 9.1 meters, while the rubber barrier's protection extended to 8.2 meters, a gap of just 900 millimeters, standing between successful protection and genuine catastrophe, a margin engineers have since worked to eliminate entirely through redundant valve systems, secondary backup air supplies, and continuous real-time sensor monitoring, ensuring that particular near-miss never happens again. When asked directly, what happens if one of the rubber bladders were to fail or burst, engineers gave a simple answer. There are 3 independent bladders, and at least one will always hold. The barrier itself has never failed, but in studying it, engineers uncovered an entirely separate and unexpected structural flaw elsewhere along the coast, one that required, of all things, deliberately inviting more water in, rather than keeping it out, dumping 21.5 million cubic meters of sand into a single offshore location on purpose, and then simply walking away and letting nature take over from there. The traditional method for maintaining eroding beaches had always been adding fresh sand roughly every 4 years in small increments. This new approach, instead, dumped roughly 20 years' worth of sand in one single operation, letting ocean currents naturally redistribute that material along the coastline over time, with waves alone moving literally millions of tons of material for free continuously every single day since the project began in 2011, a process that, as of right now, is still ongoing. In one further innovation, engineers made a deliberate decision to stop building walls any higher and instead lower the land itself alongside a major river, deliberately excavating a brand new 9-kilometer river channel through existing farmland to give floodwater somewhere safe to go rather than forcing it against city defenses. A single new channel that, on its own, lowers the overall flood peak in that river system by 27 centimeters, a modest-sounding number that is, in practice, more than enough to keep an entire city dry during a serious flood event. Elsewhere, engineers placed an artificial beach directly in front of an existing dike, allowing the sloped sand dune to absorb the force of incoming waves entirely on its own, meaning the actual concrete dike behind it experiences almost no wave impact whatsoever during even a significant storm. All of this belongs to a single coordinated national program made up of roughly 30 individual projects, which together raise the country's official flood safety standard along the Rhine River system from a 1 in 1,250 year event threshold to a 1 in 2,000 year threshold. Every single barrier in the system built directly on the lessons learned from the one that came before it. 90 years of continuous engineering evolution. Each generation of Dutch engineers improving on the mistakes and near disasters of the last. Having built their own survival from scratch, the Netherlands now exports that same accumulated knowledge to virtually every other country on Earth, currently facing rising seas and increasingly violent storms. In January of 2023, during Storm Pia, the automated BOS system triggered again, and the Maeslant-carrying barrier protecting Rotterdam closed for only the second time in its entire operational history, every major barrier across the country's coastline coordinating in near-perfect unison. controlled largely by systems designed and refined by a single continuous line of Dutch engineers spanning multiple generations. There have been 0 recorded flood deaths in the Netherlands since 1953, not because the storms ever stopped coming, and not because the North Sea ever lost any of its power, but because, generation after generation, one country methodically built something powerful enough to stand directly between itself and the ocean. The water is still out there right now, exactly as it always has been, pressing against every wall, every gate, every rubber bladder, every dune, waiting for the next storm that will inevitably come. And for now, at least, it is still losing.